Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Géraldine Amiel. I'm the bureau chief for Bloomberg News in Paris, and I'm very, very fortunate to be here. I owe it to Chiara, Clara, and many more. Thank you very much. It's really an honor. This is very interesting what you just saw about this little robot conducting an orchestra. That leads us to this panel, which is, I was kind of puzzled as to why I was asked to moderate it, but actually I'm grateful. Because earlier this year, I tried to set up a lunch meeting with someone. It was really tricky. The person travels a lot, is across the globe all the time. I also myself has a very, very busy schedule. We have different food tastes. He has food allergies. And he has a very, very patient assistant, and she was fantastic. After the course of 4 months, we managed to get that lunch, and I asked my friend how to thank his assistant, Jenny. It turned out that Jenny couldn't care less for flowers or chocolates, because Jenny is an AI. I thought, oh, yes, thank you so much. At some point, my friend said, don't bother, she doesn't exist. I said, what do you mean? It's not even a she, it's an artificial intelligence. Wow, really amazed. And she took into account the fact that he's allergic to fish, I'm allergic to peppers. So it was really something. It's a fun anecdote. I mean, I thought it was fun, but a limited one in any case. There's also the self-driving car, if you want another example. And this is seen from a consumer point of view, from all of us. And that leads me to what is at stake here in this panel. The transformation of nothing less but the economic and social world as we know it. Said like this, it's grandiloquent, it's grandiose, but think of it. Away from the customer's experience, there are companies which are transforming themselves right now as we speak. GE, Schneider Electric. It's no longer about making and selling machines. It's also about selling the intelligence which will run machines. Not staff intelligence, artificial intelligence. And this intelligence will be able to adapt, repair itself, amend itself all the time, all the time, all the time, better itself. So the business model is changing. They rethink their workforce. Does this mean job destruction? Does this mean for us the need to be better educated? Does this mean the need for us to be more mobile? The need for data, of course, because AI feeds on data, adapting our ethics, their ethics, adapting our security, their security, adapting our governance. To discuss this, because I'm but a journalist, we have a fantastic panel of experts. So we have Bernice Ang, which is sitting next to me. Bernice is the founder and executive director of Zeroth Labs. I hope I said it right. So her job is mostly, but not only, about behavioral insights, urbanization challenges. Next to Bernice is Patrice Kane. He's the CEO of Thales, space, defense, aerospace, security and transportation company headquartered near Paris. Forgive me, Patrice. Next to Patrice, then we have Kimberly Line-Mattison. She's the general manager at Microsoft Norway. She's going to speak English, though, because I can't do Norwegian. And then Melissa Sefkin, forgive me, is that right? Yes. It's an interesting line. Principal scientist, design anthropologist at Renault-Nissan Alliance. So you're working on autonomous vehicles, and this could change our world. So let me kickstart this discussion with a very quite large question. What do we mean by artificial intelligence, and how is it going to be a positive evolution?
Sure.
Bernice, go ahead.
Okay, I'll just give the quickest 2-point primer on what AI is, because the rest you can go and Google. The first is that not all artificial intelligence is machine learning. And the second, which is related, is there are between 5 to 9 or more fields of AI. Some of these are neural networks, speech processing, computer vision. There are a bunch of others, and it also depends how finely you slice them. And as to whether or not the good, whether or not it's good or bad. This is a really tricky question. I think the first thing I would say about technology and AI is that the technology itself is amoral. It is neither benevolent nor malevolent, although the people who create it could be. And what we're concerned about is the knock-on effects of the technology, and whether or not these will be good or bad, as we perceive it, will, I think, be a function of the meaning and the significance that we attach to the things that will be impacted. So this is where we start to get into the whole topic of the future of jobs, social protections, cities, and the rest of it. But in the final assessment, I think whether humanity will have seen this as a good or bad thing in the future, looking back to now, I think is determined by our ability to respond, adapt to these changes, and in some case, we might have to make some pretty dramatic changes to systems that have been very fundamental to us for a long time, which will take a lot of political will and leadership.
Patrice.
Well, perhaps let me first answer on an industrial standpoint. The introduction of AI is obviously unavoidable. It was often said that software is eating the world. Tomorrow or today, we can say that AI is going to eat software. So it's already a reality, especially in the B2C world. You find AI algorithms almost everywhere now, even if you don't know that they are there. And it's becoming more and more widely used in B2B or B2G industries. So as Thales, it's already a reality. And I can give you at least 2 examples where AI could bring or will bring benefit to, let's say, end customers or the society. First is how can we optimize the aircraft trajectory real time? Currently, when you get on board a plane, the flight path is frozen 24 hours in advance. So if something unexpected happened during the flight, it's up to the pilot to take the best decision. Tomorrow, even today, in fact, by, I would say, gathering data coming from air traffic management control bodies, from airports in terms of congestions, coming from weather forecast agencies, you are able to optimize, to predict and optimize the trajectory, which has twofold benefits. First, if you consume less fuel, that's extremely important economic advantage for the airlines. And secondly, it has a positive impact in terms of environment. Another example, which is probably also coming, let's say, by 2020, so it's tomorrow, it's autonomous trains. We speak a lot about autonomous cars, but ground transportation or transport operators are clearly looking at introducing AI in train operations to have autonomous trains. It's a challenging, I would say, issue. Probably not as challenging as for plane, because the psychological dimension is probably less accurate. However, it is a challenging issue, but we have almost everything in hands to solve this challenging question. And again, the benefit would be, I would say, more efficiency, about 30%, and an increased level of safety for the train or transport operators. Now, last comment. I know it's controversial. We are in defense also, as Thales, and clearly defense should be, I would say, tackled in a very specific manner, but I'm sure we'll come back on that later on.
We will. Yes, so I think about it very simply in a sense. I just see we don't have the economic growth in the world that we need, and we have really big problems still to solve. Poverty and disease and hunger, and artificial intelligence, like other technology advancements, is going to be part of these solutions in a profound way. And we're just getting to the stage with artificial intelligence where after many decades of research. Now we've built on the technology, we've brought it to a stage where we're just taking it out of huge, intense resource, custom-made environments where very few people actually have the capabilities to build this stuff, to a position where we've got it into a toolkit. Yeah, that's the company I work for. Microsoft's business model is essentially to bring cognitive services into Lego blocks, if you will. And just like we can build with Lego blocks on many things, we can build the Lego blocks of cognitive services or artificial intelligence on top of cloud-based technology that's really enabling at a lower cost than we had before us to be able to break through. And that's the moment we're at. And we can see many, 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 many examples, right? And when it's a toolkit and a Lego kit, that's when the innovation will start to become exponential. And that's how we will make AI part of the global good.
Okay. Melissa.
Thank you for having me. Yes, there it is. I would repeat many of what I've already heard and a part of from my colleagues here, that I think it's important to think about AI not as this mysterious singular thing that's there, but something that's integrated already and informing many parts of our lives and active in many kinds of ways. And as Bernice said, it's made up of so many different parts and systems. It's actually very complex sets of things that need to come together. So a simple example from the world that I exist in, the development of self-driving or autonomous vehicles. Think of what it's like when you drive down the street and you're going through an intersection. Maybe you stop at a stop sign, or if you live somewhere that there aren't many stop signs, you're going through a light, and then you go and you cross. Maybe you're turning left, or if you're in the United States, if you turn left, just as here, you're going to have to cross lanes. Well, for a car to make its way and figure out what it needs to do to get through that intersection by itself is quite complex. Because if you think about it, the lanes disappear. So if it's been using the lanes to guide itself, it now needs to know how to position itself inside of that intersection. It needs to account for whether there's other road users around and people in that environment. So when we talk about AI, we're talking about something that is figuring out, it's trying to achieve a goal, and these goals can be piece by piece quite small along the way. And it's trying to achieve that goal, and it figures out how to do that by itself. So how we get to where it's going to be increasingly of benefit to us is that we, I think, inform it with the things that matter to us as people. These are machines that we're building. They're being built by us. They're being built for us, I hope. And so the more that we inform it with a kind of social intelligence and consider the human in that, the better decisions it can kind of make. But it is a very complex set of factors that go into these AI.
Okay, very interesting. But then when you think of it, and all of you seem to say that we can expect a lot of positive things for us down the line with AI, I was wondering, and since this is the Women's Forum, are we going to reproduce, for instance, our gender diversity biases via artificial intelligence, or is it a way to actually improve our society in that regard? Anyone? Melissa, you were about to speak.
So that's up to us and how we handle it. The answer to that is not in the technology itself. It'll be how we organize, how we incent those who are participating to engage in the values and concerns that are there. So there's no answer that's independent of the moves that we take, how we regulate, how we organize our workplaces that are developing these. And all that, but there are risks of it reinstituting certain kinds of biases. If we talk about, though Bernice said, it's not all machine learning. If you do think about machine learning, though, just to, again, try to get practical about how it really works, you're feeding the system with a whole bunch of data so that it can learn and figure out for itself the important patterns in there. So you have to ask what kind of data the machines are being trained on. And if you don't give them a diversity of data points, then they will reproduce in a narrow kind of way. So again, there's no inherent answer to that, but it will take care for us not to reproduce some of the biases.
Just to quickly
Bernice, go ahead.
Yeah, to Melissa's point. Just very quickly, I think one of the things that we can do to mitigate bias in our algorithms is actually in the composition of teams. So, the teams themselves being diverse actually helps in how the algorithm ends up. And also in the design and the research process in building your, well, let's not say product, okay, let's say product, that if there is a very intentional effort in including the perspective of different kinds of humans that this algorithm will serve, then that also helps.
Patrice.
But I think we have all heard about this story, machine becoming to dialogue or to convey racist messages because the data was biased. So it was not the fault of the algorithm, but clearly of the data which fed the intelligence of the machine.
Kimberly, is this something that... Go ahead. Please answer.
So in the Microsoft world, there was a really interesting example. I think it was 2 years ago. We launched a chatbot in the US called HAL. And it's, for those of you who have been in the US, you will have heard about this. And HAL quickly learned some pretty awful things from people who were feeding Tao some pretty awful things.
Such as?
I mean, just unspeakable things. Yeah, when you talk, smut to a chatbot at that stage anyway, then the chatbot learns those verbal patterns and begins to mimic them and begins to adopt them as part of the landscape that it's learning from, right? As part of a proper way to speak. So, remarkably, Satya Nadella did not shut that entire team down and go into a hole and treat it like it was a disaster, because in many senses it was in that instance a disaster, but rather sent a really phenomenal email to that group that then went viral in the company and probably outside. But it said, we really missed it this time, but thank you, team, for all the hard work you're doing, and let's come back stronger and let's learn from this. So it's an example of an evolving technology where we all need to learn. It's an example of, now we have a new release, a new version in the States, a year and a half on, called Zoe, and we're learning. So we're also learning that failures will happen along the way. We're also learning we have to have some tolerance for that if we're going to make the advances that we want to.
Well, this is very interesting because you would think, and there are a lot of examples beyond this one where I think it was Google which allowed to artificial intelligences to discuss with each other, and they started to invent their own language. Stop me if I'm wrong, if I get the facts wrong. And they had to stop them. They had to unplug them because it was going nowhere and it was sort of scary. When you see the example that you're quoting, the one that I'm citing, do you think, guys, that we need ethics? Do you think that we need, a bit like the French government, right? I don't know if you're aware of that. The French government has asked a very famous mathematician, Cédric Villani, to look into that, how best to regulate artificial intelligence. Is this something that is needed? Do we need to regulate it? And how strong do we need to regulate it? Patrice.
There is a clear need, at least for defense and security applications, for sure. I'm sure that you've heard again this summer about Elon Musk and 100 entrepreneurs. They have written to the UN to ask them to set clear limitations in terms of lethal autonomous weapons. And then another famous guy, Mark Zuckerberg, answered about this topic. Definitely, it's a legitimate debate, limitation of the use of AI in some fields. Now, we need to have, I would say, a clear-headed and dispassionate debate. Again, AI is just a technology. So it will be good or bad, it will be for the best or for the worst, depending on our own decision. And for sure, there is a political, ethical, and moral debate that should happen on the use of AI, in particular in very sensitive fields.
Sure. Actually, it's interesting you mentioned the UN. So just a few days ago, where I flew from to this conference, I was in Bangkok. And it was I was with the OHCHR, which is a long jargon for the UN's Agency on Human Rights. And so these guys were developing their regional strategy. And my piece, I was supposed to come in as the resource person on the intersect between technology and the right to participation, right? So actually, if you indulge me, I'll just share a couple of the stuff that I said, just very briefly, because it's actually really relevant to this conversation. So I thought of it in terms of chronology, right? And so a couple of recommendations I made in the immediate term was to look at internet access possibly as a right. But if we want to do that, then we actually may be required to rethink the definition of what is a public good and what is a private good, and should internet services be a public good. In the medium term, the idea of the ownership of one's user-generated data. I'm a very good user of many, many apps. But the ownership of this data as a right, because the fear of your data being used against your wishes should not be a barrier to your full participation in society. And the third, and this is really way out there, you can just treat it as comic relief, it's the right to exercise free will. And what this is actually about the right to not be cognitively manipulated. All right, so I think like these are, of course, just some things I kind of shot off for them to consider for their guidelines, but that tells us the importance of creating a few possible scenarios of futures so that we can use these as ways to stretch our policy-making mental models in order to be as prepared as we can for various scenarios.
Yep, I think it's worth just reflecting as well that this, this thing called artificial general intelligence, where machines actually become capable of surpassing humans in all types of understanding and action taking and all of that, that's a long way off. Maybe not even in this century. But what is happening now, and maybe by the end of this decade, it's said that machines will be at human level with speech and voice recognition. So being able to visually and auditorially match the level of a human being. That may occur by the end of the decade here. So when we think about regulation, I think it's important to not have doomsday scenarios in our mind as if these are very near term. And then thinking about regulation, it's certainly not easy to regulate properly and keep the balance of allowing innovation to happen while you provide enough protections and benefits for all in such an evolving and dynamic space. So I also want to emphasize the role of self-regulation that's super important here. And to that point, the leading technology companies in the area about a year ago got together and created a forum and committed to develop some ethics around the good usage of AI. And that's a really important initiative. So they're designing against principles for AI already. And these are the folks that are deepest and very, very deep into the construction of this now. So it's really important that they're leading the way on these topics. So things like having a mission when you build AI that you augment or enhance human capabilities, not compete with humans per se directly. Things like that you have transparency built into how you're building AI or the algorithms, or algorithmic accountability, one could call it. Really important when we think about eventually could evil machines take over the world. Algorithmic accountability allows you to always understand and trace back the way that the machines are operating. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So principles like this are by those that are deepest into AI expertise right now, also banding together is a really important form of regulation, perhaps one of the most important forms right now where we are.
Melissa, you agree?
Yes, I would just add to that. I'm very glad you brought up about the difference between a general AI and the specific instances. So I think there will be some unevenness at the timing in which more regulatory enforcement should come into play, according to different aspects of where artificial intelligence-related technologies are being deployed. But I think the ethics question is also needs to be thought about, as it sounds like my colleagues here are doing so in a variety of ways. And that comes down to our everyday practices, again, at work, on the job, those who are developing it, those who are deciding strategically about the next steps of things to develop, how the kind of ethical thinking is brought to bear in terms of some of that development. And so, again, it brings us back to the point of diversity. It's not just gender diversity, it's not just national or racial diversity, it's also diversity of fields and areas of domains of knowledge and thought that need to be brought to bear to this.
Well, someone like Elon Musk, though, and he's Elon Musk, that's someone who's actually not silly, really warned about the dangers of artificial intelligence. So, are we, is he right? Is he doing so right? I mean, is he right in doing so? Or, Patrice, I mean, you work on defense, you know how lethal these things can be.
Let's put it a different way. Instead of speaking of AI, which is a kind of a buzzword and generates a lot of either passion or concern, you could think of this technology as being a technology giving autonomy to, let's say, a machine, a platform, a sensor, or whatever. So the question is, what autonomy do we want as human beings to delegate to a machine? And obviously, there are things that we accept, we can delegate to a machine, because it's a repetitive task, it's something which is not sensitive, and things we do not want to delegate. So the risks raised by Elon Musk can be reformulated differently. Autonomy, what do we want to delegate? What do we want to keep as a decision that needs to be taken by human beings?
And pushing a red button?
Should not be delegated.
Okay. This brings me to another question. You were saying initially, Kimberly, that AI can actually be part of the solutions to a better world, notably in terms of growth, economy. What does it mean, do you think, for instance, Kimberly, Melissa, Patrice, because right now all people think of is about job cuts. So how can we mitigate that vision of the impact of the AI on our global on our economies? Do you think it's some companies are developing it basically because of cost cuts that they involve, and they disguise this as efficiency? So we're more efficient, but actually you're cutting jobs, you're cutting costs. So,
well, I think there's no doubt that artificial intelligence will have impacts on jobs, but one must also remember all of the waves and waves and waves and waves of technology before that have had impacts on jobs. They've also brought enormous positive benefits, right? Mm-hmm. And the last time, a century ago, where we had an enormous technological revolution, we were also, by the increased productivity that we had, we were also able to put millions and millions of children in school for the first time in developing countries and developed countries of today, right? And we had an enormous increase in welfare and quality of living for everybody all around. So when we think about AI, again, back to the world's biggest problems that we have to solve, we need it very much. When we think about the inclusiveness agenda that we've talked about here, various aspects of diversity, I learned not long ago that actually 1 in 5 people in the world have a disability. I didn't know it was that high. And so when you see AI applied to people with visual impairment or hearing impairment, and you see that a person who walked across the street before couldn't see anything around them, they were so visually impaired, but now they have a little voice hooked up to their ear and lenses and computers in their glasses that tells them that there's a child playing with a red ball that's gone across the street in their ear. So they experience life in a whole different way, right? People that couldn't be productive before can now with these new technologies. So we must also be focused and mindful on where we have come from and our resilience in being able to create jobs. I just think, how many things could we have people, us, do for each other that we actually don't have the means to or the productivity to employ ourselves to do for each other? What about more art? What about more music? What about more caring? The world needs so many more great tasks, jobs, great things for us to do and fulfill. And maybe through technologies like AI, we'll also become dramatically more able to do so, to allocate resources to those types of things.
We have less than 5 minutes. I was wondering, when you mentioned that, this is very interesting, is it going to reshuffle the cards? Right now, it's the Western world that, with China, that leads the way in terms of artificial intelligence. I mean, mostly America and China. Europe is a bit behind. Does it mean that at some point it could reshuffle the cards? Could it mean more growth for what we are currently calling developing countries, if they're, putting a strong effort into it? How do you see that, redistributing the cards?
I think it's an interesting question, and it's a hopeful attitude that there could be some reshuffling of what might come. I think the reality is today it's very resource intensive to engage AI. The compute power alone, the data that you need, and all that requires a lot of resources. And even those who are highly developed and have resources at hand are always striving for the next thing. Now we need the quantum computing and quantum computers to do things even faster. So it's not going to reshuffle things just by itself. Again, that will come back to the decisions that are made, the partnerships, public-private, with academia and all the different stakeholders and players about how those arrangements are made as to where the resources will come from and being provided.
Patrice?
Well, perhaps I will say something a bit different. At least in our domains, I think that this is a real breakthrough. And when I look at clearly the traditional players in our field, sure, things are going to move quite fast. And cards maybe not, but maybe reshuffled. We may see new actors, new players, new entrants. Look at, even if it's not directly linked to AI, but look at the space domain, the famous so-called new space. You have new entrants. We've talked about Elon Musk. Look, nobody thought it would be possible to drastically diminish the costs to launch a satellite, and he did it. So it's not directly linked to AI, but each time a breakthrough, a technological breakthrough arises, yes, it may create a real disruption in the market and see new entrants coming in.
If I could build on Kimberly's point earlier, our whole conception of jobs is because of the current economic model we have. We have inputs, wage labor, means of production, other stuff, outputs, right? If one component of that, which is wage labor, is dramatically reduced, then it fundamentally becomes a different model. The question is, what kind of model would that be? And so then Kimberly talked about the ability for us maybe to then pursue arts, music, and all these kinds of things. It's actually, to me, a very beautiful vision, right? And then, so the question is, how do we pay for that, right? So there are so many efficiencies and productivity gains that we can get from technology, which is the great thing about it, that makes me hope we can actually transition from a wage labor model to where humans thrive as humans, and we are the best expression of our humanity, and collectively, imagine what that would look like. And so whether that's through universal basic income or some other approaches, I mean, that's all, I guess, that's the jury's out on that, right? But that this kind of future, I think, is, where you're not enslaved to a job because you have to do it. Well, if you do feel enslaved to your job, if you really love your job, then maybe you can do that without worrying about what salary you're going to get, because salary will no longer be a benchmark of your human worth or your social status pegging instrument or any of these things that are just external markers of who we are as persons inside.
We're nearing the end of this panel, and I'm going to sum up a little bit what has been said by our distinguished members here. Bernie started to say that artificial intelligence is amoral. So that's interesting. It's a positive thing because it is, but it can be a positive thing depending on our ability to respond and adapt. Now is a defining moment. Patrice said that in any case, as worried and as we can be, AI is already a reality. It's about more efficiency, of course, but if you put it more simpler, as Kimberly said, it's a technology that is going to be part of the solution, a custom-made solution. For instance, cognitive services, part of the Lego. It's a Lego brick amongst other solutions that we have. Melissa said actually that yes, AI is certainly not a mysterious single thing. It's out there. It's a useful tool. It's up to us to prevent artificial intelligence from reproducing our bias, gender bias, diversity bias. We can do so by filtering the data. We have to make intentional efforts. So more of these conferences, ladies. And beyond what we called interesting, what I would call interesting experiment, Microsoft one, for instance, where the AI turns out to be sexist, racist, just if I say right, or have its own language and exclude us, it's clear that there's a need to regulate it, notably for defense and security consideration. Don't leave the red button to artificial intelligence, says Patrice. I certainly won't. It's a political and ethical debate that has just started. It's not really clear that we will see by the end of the century machines surpassing the human beings. And I want to thank you, Kimberly, for that. Because when I'm in front of my food processor, it's just not working like that way. The machine does surpass me. Self-regulation might be the answer rather than government-led effort, as the French government is currently doing. And the industry, the high-tech industry, has already started to draft principles. I'm really interested in these ones, by the way, if I can speak to you about that. It's about transparency as well. It's also our everyday practices that we are going to put into the artificial intelligence. Still, is there a danger out there? Well, it just depends on the autonomy that you want to delegate to machines. That's what Patrice said. Remember the red button. It will have an impact on jobs. It will have an impact on our social environment, as did any other industrial revolution before, or any technological progresses that the humanity made. We will adapt. That's what Kimberly said, Melissa as well. We will adapt. We will adapt. It will be a real breakthrough, a great element in repairing humans, in creating a more inclusive world. It might potentially reshuffle also the cards between the developed and the developing world. Why not? It will create disruption into the markets that seemed to be, there and very well installed. It will create opportunities for companies that didn't have opportunities before. As Bernice said, and I will put it as the final word, artificial intelligence can be the best expression of our humanity. As far as I'm concerned, if I'm not happy with it, I will unplug it. Think about that. And I thank you very, very much, everyone. Thank you.